Welcome to Joining the Dots. I'm Thomas Strowan, your host. This podcast explores real-life insights from those dedicated to pursuing justice, reducing harm, and enhancing global security. As co-founder of Clue Software and a technologist, I collaborate daily with diverse teams tackling some of the most pervasive problems in the world, ranging from child abuse to human trafficking, organised crime, fraud, and much more. In Joining the Dots, I speak with those deeply entrenched in these worlds. The victims, the perpetrators, the investigators, the leaders, the techies, the academics. The often unsung heroes on the front line, working to tirelessly create a safer world. Welcome to Joining the Dots. Welcome to another edition of Joining the Dots. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Laura Eshelby. Laura has spent 20 years in government, helping the UK build resilience against the threat of fraud and economic crime. In her journey through government, Laura has been on the front line of investigating and preventing fraud. She's risen through the ranks, ultimately being one of the key architects behind the UK government's response to fraud. More recently, she's moved into the private sector, into Clue, where we're obviously delighted that she's joined. But the reason I'm particularly interested in this conversation is because over the past 20 years, Laura has witnessed firsthand how fraud, particularly cyber-enabled fraud, has risen to become one of the biggest challenges that we face as a society. So first of all, Laura, welcome.
Thanks, Thomas. Great to be here today.
So just to refamiliarise you and our listeners, and to orientate ourselves, we kick off with a question which explores why you chose the path you chose. We get into the main thrust of the conversation in the middle part, and then we end with a bit of crystal ball gazing, looking at from 2030 and making some predictions. So if you're happy with that, we're going to kick off.
Yep, sounds good.
Great. So firstly, if you wouldn't mind touching a bit on your career journey, why fraud? And then perhaps also linked to that, what is fraud? How has it evolved to what it is today?
Yeah, so like a lot of people that I've met over the years, I didn't actively choose to work in counter-fraud. I graduated from university and applied for a graduate trainee programme and ended up working as an auditor in the Ministry of Justice. Back then it was the Legal Services Commission I was working in. And I spent a year auditing solicitors' claims for work done. And it was very interesting looking into areas like mental health, immigration. And as I was auditing these claims, which back then was literally paper-based, so, going through massive files of paper in different solicitors' offices across London and beyond, I came across many, which I now know to be fraud, but erroneous claims. I must have been up and down to the Special Investigations Unit so many times in that year.
Assume you can spot them a mile off after a while.
Well, at first, I just thought, are they exaggerated claims? Am I right? I was still learning in my audit kind of role. But the account manager said to me, Laura, you've got a really keen eye for spotting like missing evidence or timelines that didn't add up. And also, duplicate claims. So people reusing, particularly in asylum cases, you'd see the same very similar stories time and time again being reused. So I eventually was persuaded by the Special Investigations Unit then to apply for a job as a trainee investigator. I then trained in financial investigation, and the unit specialised in cases of high value legal aid. So anyone, particularly in the criminal courts, defendants that had legal aid bills that were going to reach £1 million, if they had assets that were declared including overseas assets, complex company accounts, and alleged terrorists. So they were the kind of cases, the threshold that the unit looked into. And I was just gripped from there, and I just found it so fascinating. And I went on to do further training around bribery and corruption, and later fraud. And then every time someone left the unit, I'd work my way up and get promoted, which was great. And over time, became the head of fraud at the Ministry of Justice. After that time, I was very fortunate to go to the Cabinet Office in 2014 when they were looking to establish a counter-fraud function, so setting up structures beyond what already existed in tax and welfare for the rest of government. And that was really putting counter fraud on an equal footing with other established functions like commercial and finance and audit, setting standards and consistent processes and ways of working to maximise how we find and stop fraud across government.
In some ways, that's amazing. Like the way that you said that is that, yeah, we knew this thing. We knew it was a thing with DWP and with HMRC because it's tax and collections and distributing, so therefore fraud. But the thought that up until 2014, it wasn't deemed important enough to have that same rigor across other areas is quite interesting.
Yeah, so I would say it wasn't important. I'd say the evidence base didn't exist. And very much with fraud, the nature of fraud is a hidden crime. If you don't put in investment, resources and tools to find it, you can't fight it. So it was that there hadn't been active investment until 2014 onwards. A cross-government review, I think led by a task force with Francis Maud back then, led to that question about, well, what is happening beyond tax and welfare? Do we know the levels of loss? And the answer was no. So then I spent the next few years really digging in across government to find out how much do we know about the risks out there, how much have we invested in different areas, and what is happening when we are responding and investigating. And that led to further findings around capability. And again, finding that across government, it was very mixed in terms of capability in both investigation, the use of data analytics, and also intelligence gathering. And that really formed the early thinking back in 2015 with some of the senior leaders in HMRC and Health, Home Office, to think about building a profession dedicated to those practitioners and to bring them together as a collective, again, to have a more consistent way to tackle fraud.
And how, just in terms of what, a bit of a definition here of what is fraud, you know, as I mentioned in the intro, you've kind of witnessed this over the past 20 years, but, you know, what is it and how is it evolved? And therefore, why do we need all this?
Yeah, so, you know, but we're very lucky in the UK to have the Fraud Act, which kind of came in halfway through my career, I guess, in 2006. It's misrepresentation or the provision of false information to gain an advantage. So how does that manifest in government and in industry? Really in quite similar ways. So if you think about it, in government or in industry, everyone is procuring services, contracts, hiring people. All of those give rise to the opportunity for fraud to occur. So whether it's false CVs, false qualifications, and we see cases in NHS and healthcare quite often in the media around people coming forward with false qualifications, or whether it's people providing false information or exaggerating information around pre-contract or pre-procurement tenders. So yeah, it can manifest in many ways. Some of the interesting types of fraud that we used to come across in the Ministry of Justice was twofold in terms of identity fraud. One was using genuine identities, particularly around asylum seekers, and then reusing those over and over again. And in one of the biggest cases I worked in before I left the Ministry of Justice, we used data analytics to match with the Home Office to identify that one particular firm had been providing false identities for over 7 years. So literally running a factory. Collaboration is key. People talk about data sharing quite a lot. One of the great things around working in government is there is an openness to share information to help to find fraud at the earliest opportunity. And increasingly, I think we're seeing that partnership across industry and government come together as well to tackle fraud.
And just using the example you mentioned about that at the Ministry of Justice, where you found this organisation that had, you know, industrialising fake identity creation. How do they go about doing that?
So in this particular case, they were using genuine previous asylum seekers' details and then reusing those, changing other elements of the claims. So it'd be quite hard to detect with the naked eye. That's where data analytics can come in, using different attributes to scan across large data sets to look for patterns or anomalies. The other type of identity fraud that we'd see is completely false identities, so completely fictitious ghost clients, as we would call them. And that's something that is not unique to the Ministry of Justice at all, and could happen in any type of business area where claims are being made for work done or for applications.
Yeah, I mean, I at our conference that we held 2 weeks ago, I was chatting to someone from in the kind of fraud profession within the Department of Education, and they were talking about the fact that they get a lot of fictitious students. So, have schools and academies claiming for more students than they have. So,
yeah. There's been some quite famous cases, both in the UK and overseas in Australia, with academies and education providers putting in false claims for students that have never been trained. That's where, again, data analytics can be really helpful. So post payment for student places or for educational provision, using data analytics to overlay, using different data points to verify that those claims are true. I remember early in my career as well, working with a particular government agency who were looking at childcare provision, and were able to use different data sources to verify that the actual premises where the children were allegedly being cared for didn't exist. And nowadays, with the onset of technology, that would be much easier to do in real time as well.
Yeah, and how what I find quite interesting is what kind of cases might have been prevalent 20 years ago, and what are prevalent today. So what I'm trying to get at here is what's changed to make this this fraud. It's often termed an epidemic, isn't it? I've certainly used that term a few times. What is it that's made it just proliferate so much?
I think we see the same modus operandi being used by criminals in terms of there has to be either false information, compromised identity or account, or credit facility, that those things are the same as they were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But I think the way that they're executed have changed. So I know the City of London Police estimate over 70% of frauds detected have an international element now. So I think back 20 years ago, you were more likely to be dealing with an offender in the same jurisdiction. I think the opposite is true now. Criminals can now use technology to target you in your own home, or if you're out and about with your mobile devices at any point, and remain pretty anonymous. I think that's why we face such a huge scale of fraud.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so much lower risk than you get a lot of traditional sort of criminals doing armed robbery or whatever, robbing a shop or whatever. That's dangerous. They can get in quite a bit of harm. They put themselves at risk. Whereas with fraud, you could be in a back room somewhere in a very physically safe location, and you can commit crime. It seems like a bit of a no-brainer if you're a criminal in some ways to migrate to fraud.
I think we've really seen the commercialisation of fraud toolkits as well, readily available online. So if you were a bad actor and wanted to, venture into investment fraud, for example, or phishing, there are toolkits that can be bought quite cheaply online. I once met Frank Abagnale, who is famous for the Catch Me If You Can films, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. And he said, exactly to your point, Thomas, that, back when he was doing check fraud, remember checks? He had to carry, this big, huge printing equipment around with him. But to your point, nowadays, you don't need that. All you need is a phone or a laptop. And unfortunately, you can cause quite a lot of harm in a relatively short space of time for quite a low amount of investment.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of landscape is pretty scary. And what that says to me is there's going to be more of it happening because, there is an epidemic, but it feels like there's just a lot of opportunity, especially as technology and AI develops, to exploit this more. So should we move on to a slightly separate area? Let's think about what are some of the biggest challenges that are there that prevent effective counter-fraud work?
I think one of the biggest barriers that we see, because as you say, technology is advanced. There are lots of tools, techniques and services available to help people evaluate controls, monitor their transactions, their processes, their services, and to take action when it's found. So what is the barrier? I think the barrier is cultural. I think it goes back to kind of where I started in 2014, where if you're not seeing the evidence of fraud or corruption in your organisation, it's very difficult to make the case for investment. So how do you get around that? How do you tackle that? I think what you need to do is, or my advice would be, is to choose some areas, some thematic reviews, deploy some data analytics to test those areas and see what the kind of levels of irregularity or particular maybe fraud may be. And that can then help to build a business case to get the conversation started, really. Fraud is kind of fought in the details. So the more you can be specific about the threats that you're facing within your particular organisation, the more likely you are to have the wider business support you and work with you to help you both find it and fight it.
So the first thing you've got to do is admit you've got a problem, I suppose is what you're saying, in other words. And would it be fair to say that just most organisations, particularly of a certain size, scale or activity they undertake, are going to have a problem?
Yeah, I think it's very challenging, and we can question the incentivisation around that. So in some industries like the financial sector, they're fortunate in some ways because they're highly regulated around anti-money laundering and other kind of economic crime offences. So that means that there is already a structure to come forward with information and to report suspicious activity. In other sectors, there's different levels of maturity and different mechanisms for providing that information. I think it's also a question about, well, what do we do if we do find it? Where do we turn? And, again, organisations will be at different levels of maturity in terms of both resources and the ability to know kind of what action we should take. I think one of the things I have seen over the years is an increasing willingness, and this particularly came out during COVID, for sectors to support each other with best practice and ideas around what you can do, both to detect it, but then to respond. And I do see a really increased willingness for those sectors to come together, whether it's law enforcement and banking or government and law enforcement, to kind of, as I say, share both intelligence, but also to share best practice.
Yeah. So you've admitted there's a problem. You're looking into how to isolate and find this problem. Data analytics might be an option. You find some. I can imagine the natural inclination is to not want to find it or deal with it or bury it, or reputational challenges. It's like, no, can't we? We need to. Do you see that in organisations?
So in my 20 years, I'd be lying if I didn't say I hadn't come across people who, would rather suppress the fraud they had found. I think it can also be difficult for people to, especially if it's around insider fraud, for people, or if it's a preferred supplier or, someone they've had a kind of long-standing relationship with commercially. It can be quite emotional in some ways for people to realise that's happened. I think there is a fear that businesses worry that it will be seen negatively, their controls have been breached. But as we've just said, Thomas, technology is so evolved, and criminals, bad actors, they do this as a business. So we shouldn't feel shame as business leaders, or if fraud does occur.
It's almost problematic if you're not seeing it. That's probably a better indicator.
Yeah,
if there is.
I think that's absolutely true. And in particular, being really alive to what your key risks are, it really is important. So, for example, the old-fashioned way to deal with fraud would be to be reactive and wait for referrals to trickle in, maybe via a hotline or something like that. But what businesses should be doing is being bold, being proactive and thinking, why are we not seeing any insider threat? Is that because we don't have any mechanisms or processes in place for people to speak up, or for us to proactively go out and verify maybe pre and post employment? So an absence doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have a problem. It may be that you just haven't detected it yet.
Yeah. So that's on the sort of organisational side. If we go on to sort of the people who undertake fraud, part of what I've seen, and I've spoken to a couple of our guests about this, is that fraud can often be glamorized. You can often see people displaying, signs of wealth on Instagram and showing a sort of life that's unattainable. And you kind of dig a bit deeper and you see this sort of strange sort of pride around often what I would term to seem like quite fraudulent activity.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing that, especially in certain parts of the world as well. That makes it actually harder for law enforcement in the UK to fight back against some of our international bad actors, because there are certain cultures that are glamorising it. I think you may be aware, Thomas, of some of like the scam schools or fraud schools in certain countries where they are literally opting not to go to college, but to choose that fraudulent or criminal lifestyle. It's definitely celebrated in some cultures.
Yeah. And the other thing I was speaking to one of our customers from a UK government organisation, but they've got operations in lots of different countries around the world, and the chap was telling me that it's a different culture in different countries. So what is fraud and or corruption in the UK, as defined by our relatively developed society, is not in another jurisdiction. I'm going to use an example. I'm not suggesting that this jurisdiction has particular issues, but in Nigeria there's a culture around tipping, around paying hotels for agency fees and things, which is just normal activity. Yet if you determined it according to the UK, it would be fraud. So I just wonder that cultural differences, whether that's sort of an impact as well.
Yeah, I think it's particularly difficult around bribery and corruption, so with fraud, often there will be some kind of data point that you can verify within a different data point to identify that there's no irregularity or potentially fraud. With bribery and corruption, you're right, in different countries, they have different customs. So payments for officials or for information may be kind of how they do business. What is difficult is for UK government and businesses operating in those other jurisdictions and being able to kind of have that, tolerance and transparency around what is acceptable practice. Very challenging.
It's very challenging, but just anecdotally as well, because I've worked in this space for quite a few years. Those that operate in the counter fraud space are also very cheap to entertain. So I took another customer out for dinner. Went for a nice dinner, nothing overly spectacular, just around the corner from here, actually. I was expecting to pay the bill and didn't. Got to the end, it's like, no, listen, we really appreciate this, but we can't. We need to. If we are the practitioners of fraud, we need to be absolutely by the rules. So we had to split out the receipt. We had to, and they paid all of it. So it's like not all of it, all of their side of things. So another reflection is you got to really act as you say in this world.
Yeah, I'm very pleased with that anecdote. It's good to hear. Good values.
So I think another area I'm quite keen to have a talk about is back to talk a bit about the perpetrators or the fraudsters, and we have also talked about the organisations, but let's go back to the organisations. Let's imagine for a moment that there's a CEO of an organisation here that is undertaking relatively high consequence stuff. So it's important that there's a real risk of fraud and corruption and all those sorts of things. What would you be saying to them in terms of how they should tackle fraud?
So I think the first thing we've talked already about, that admitting there is going to be fraud. I think that's really key. The next thing is having a dedicated program of risk assessment and understanding what your areas of risk are. I think also considering for any kind of, whether it's a project, if it's an application process, a service, making sure that there's a dedicated either set aside amount to be able to deal with a problem once it arises, but also, if not, having a third party available to respond for you and having that in advance, not when an issue arises. I think that's really the key, is preempting, planning, and having policies in place.
You mentioned earlier as well around one of the difficulties, back to our analogy with the CEO sitting here, who, maybe the CFO as well. How do you value the counter fraud activity when such counter fraud activity is going to prevent? How do you value prevention? Because a good counter fraud program should reduce fraud, but it should also help prevent fraud that might have otherwise happened. How do you grapple with that?
Yeah, prevention's a tricky one. I think I wanted to pick up as well about the terminology of reduction. So we talk about reducing fraud where we have identified it. So if you're working in areas of high volume, high value fraud, such as tax and welfare, absolutely you should be in the space of reducing that over time. Many people, going back to the point earlier around mixed maturity, are not in that space. So, they are still in the space where they need to detect more. So, yeah, when we're thinking about prevention, that's something that everyone can think about as part of their strategy. There's different opportunities for prevention. So thinking about when you're setting up again, maybe it's a contract, application process, a service, payment, whatever it is, thinking up front, what are the controls you can put in place pre-award or payment to verify the legitimacy of that claim or that person or that company. So there's many data points out there that are available, some open source as well, to be able to do that. So thinking up front, again, planning, how are we going to validate claims or applications up front? If you are not able to do that for whatever reason, what's really important, a kind of second level of prevention, is prevention of future loss. So thinking you've already maybe agreed to a contract or to a service provision, validating post-award. So having that kind of ongoing monitoring. There may be the opportunity to stop a contract halfway through or, a service provision based on information that's come to light. Obviously, the ultimate approach to prevention would be to have both and to have ongoing monitoring. And that's an approach very much that you hear about transaction monitoring in the financial sector. It's something that they kind of class as a business cost and part of doing business. The other thing that I've found over the years, I helped set up the prevention panel in the Cabinet Office, again, back in 2015, 16. The reason we set that up is because many government departments didn't have established methodologies. So the thing with prevention is it has to be due to an action or, a check that you've put in place that's timely, that you can then link to that account or to that payment. So that's really important. And then having some kind of, quantification, whether that's the contract value, whether it's the benefit value, or having an average if you don't have the actual cost. So we set up the prevention panel to give government agencies the opportunity to come forward with different kind of methodologies. And then we created a methodology bank so that other people along different journeys could then adopt and use those. And there's very mature ones in places, again, like Department for Work and Pensions and Health as well.
I think what I see with government agencies and just organisations as a whole in this area, and you might tell me otherwise, but I see there's a real clear understanding that fraud detection is a necessary, and I see a lot of investment going into that front end of trying to identify potential areas, whether it be procurement fraud or wherever it might be, lots of big data systems that are helping to find anomalies. That seems to be quite prevalent. What I see as less prevalent is, okay, what do you do when you get an alert? What do you do when something might be happening? And what we see there is it's a much more manual and less sophisticated thing, which is, okay, let's go and send so and such to, have a look or whatever. Do you see that across government?
Absolutely. And I think it can put people off, doing data matching or introducing data analytic tools because of the fear of what may come back. I think what I'd say is it's much better to, do the detection and to find out where your problems are, because then you can then evaluate your controls and make system changes to prevent further harm. So I'd say it's be bold and do it. There's always a choice about how you respond. So, we don't automatically have to take a criminal sanction, for example. It may be that you can issue a fine, a contractual penalty, or some kind of, civil response. So I think about, it's really important to think about your sanctions policy and strategy as well, and to get some independent advice around that, to make sure that if you are entering into data analytics, you're thinking about how you will work through the outcomes, but also what are your options in terms of taking action. And all of those options have different cost, obviously, which is why you may want to reserve criminal prosecutions and cases for your more kind of egregious types of harm.
I just wonder, just extending that train of thought, if I draw a parallel to safeguarding. I had this conversation with Peter Spindler about 6 months ago now, but basically within the non-profit sector, I don't know if you remember the Oxfam challenges and things. So there was some challenges around reporting. So the whole sector has tried to improve the quality of reporting. So they're trying to get everyone involved in the area to really feel a culture of it's okay to report. Please do report, a culture. So what they found from that is, by God, it worked. They got a whole load of reports. They got a whole load of information coming into a central place. So it's kind of mission accomplished. And then they're sitting there going, oh God, what are we going to do with all this? Have we got to take everything seriously? Have we got to go and follow up every single thing? How do I know if this is connected to that, which is connected to this, and all this sort of stuff? And I wonder if there's a similar thing going on within counter fraud, where lots of great success in detection, but careful what you wish for, because now we've detected a whole load of stuff and we now need to do something with it.
Yeah, I think it brings to light a point about being really, really specific, again, aligned to your risk areas when you venture into data analytics, or when you venture into opening a hotline or calling for confidential reporting to come forward. So you want to be really specific about the information you're trying to seek, and very, very specific about what does irregularity look like. So I think if you have that information, that business insight up front, you can then create a very good case acceptance criteria, and that will really help you to triage what to focus on. You can't, unless you have unlimited resources, investigate everything and respond to everything. So linking, again, your case acceptance criteria to your risk assessment and knowledge will help you have the biggest impact in the biggest areas of harm. And that's really what we're all here to do in counter fraud.
Yeah, I mean, that's that we haven't mentioned about that, which is basically, I think, again, because we see lots of different threat areas on a global basis, organised crime and safeguarding and financial crime and various things. Fraud is an interesting one because it's right up there with the place where that has the highest level of referrals, prevention, detection and things like that. So because of the pure volume of fraud, you can't possibly look at everything. Just a fact, right? And that funnily enough, other threat areas don't have that such an acute problem. So it's right at the thick end. And I remember when we first started speaking, I thought that the fraud sector could really help other sectors to learn how to do that prioritization and how to allocate resources properly, because all these other sectors are going to have these same problems that are coming up. Even now they're coming up, but they're just not as acute, basically. So, I don't know what your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, definitely agree with that. And I think the key thing is that it's not a kind of once and done, approach. You need to continue. We've talked about how, things have evolved in the time I've been working in fraud. The threat landscape is continually changing. So the key to making sure you have a targeted response is to continually be going back to what are our business problems, what are our highest threat areas, and then making sure that any kind of control changes, any investigations, any response are aligned to those. But that needs to be continually reviewed. The other really powerful thing is when you conclude an investigation. So obviously it's great to get an outcome, maybe recover some money, or take a sanction. But there's a lot of power in how that particular issue manifested. How were they successful in perpetrating that fraud? And what can that tell us in terms of maybe future changes, again, to controls or system processes that can help us, avoid further harm. And that's really the key.
Yeah, I mean, that is a real thing. This is a thing that I think is less appreciated, that during the course of an investigation, you give an example of, often you can be really focused on the criminal justice outcome at the expense of recognizing that during the course of a really great investigation, you're going to have loads of opportunities to close vulnerabilities, identify learning, inform prevention and education plans. And I think often that's forgotten, isn't it, in this context?
Absolutely. And I think it's really important. Again, I mentioned about cross-sector working. I think it's really important that we are bold and brave and share those insights. So again, if you go back 20 years, I think there would be more of a siloed approach and people, again, not wanting to openly share the types of fraud they'd faced and how they'd manifested. I think things have changed, and there's many organisations out there who are doing a great job to help share the threats as they're identified. And I think we need to do more of that.
Yeah. I was chatting to a senior leader recently who has they have a counter fraud or they have a fraud challenge. And he said that, great, yeah, it's great to have a well-publicised case where you have brought someone to justice who has been fraudulent. But you know what? It takes sometimes years to do that. It takes a whole team to undertake it. And sometimes because of various reasons, it's not successful, disclosure, whatever it might be. So you've got a multi-year ongoing investigation that may or may not be successful, that's costing a hell of a lot of money. It's like, yes, it's a deterrent. So he was basically, his view was, yes, we should do them. I'd rather not do very many of them because they're very costly. I'd rather get much more significantly upstream of this so that we don't have to, so that we're preventing rather than, going to the cost of the criminal outcome and then the justice outcome or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's interesting around deterrent as well, because I think for certain bad actors, it will be a deterrent. If you're a professional, for example, and you have a criminal record, you may no longer be able to operate in that area. That could be a deterrent. It could be life-changing. If you're organised criminal or an organised criminal gang, it will be kind of collateral of committing crime for some of the people to go to prison. So it's less of a deterrent. I think when we talk about moving more upstream, and as I say, I think there's definitely a place for criminal prosecution, but it should be reserved for those, highest harm kind of cases, and to really send the message out, maybe in particular professions, sectors, or whatever the area of prioritisation is at the time. I think we should also think about disruption. So you may start an investigation and then find out that actually it's not just this one instance that you've identified, it's happening, across that industry or whatever it is. And I think being able to take some action to disrupt can have a bigger impact, both cost recovery wise, but also as a deterrent to that particular professional sector as well.
And I suppose that one of the challenges is that we're well set up to judge the success of a well-publicised, justice outcome. Organisations aren't as well set up to celebrate the success of a disruption or an education program or all that sort of stuff that goes in that side, which is, I guess, where technology may be able to help in terms of, helping to measure that impact.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's difficult to put a value on a control change maybe on its own. But I think what we can do is go back to when we talked about prevention earlier. If we, due to an investigation, can identify a system weakness that allowed that, we can identify the date that we changed that control, or maybe we put in more real-time evidence gathering, for example, at a point in our process. We can then monitor, and I know that health do a lot of this very well. I've been doing it for a number of years. We can then monitor that particular payment or sector over the next few, years, etc., to see how that's had an impact, and that's tangible. That's real. So yeah, it can be challenging though.
Yeah. I think before we get into our sort of our future gazing session, one final question. I haven't quite formed it in my mind, so I'll give it a go and see what you think. But we at Klug, we talk about organisations that deal with high consequence activity in various different forms. Will often have a more clearer and more obvious requirement for technology, like case management, intelligence systems like that. And if we talk about that in specifics, organisations like HMRC and DWP, and the police and the NCA and the National Economic Crime Centre, they are clearly at that end of the we know we need technology. So first of all, I wonder if you have any reflections for how those sort of organisations can may be able to improve their approach to fraud. But then secondly, let's go down that scale a little bit. Let's go down to these organisations that perhaps arguably aren't dealing at that sort of quite the level of high consequence, but nonetheless will have significant fraud problems that are costing either shareholders or the public purse money. What would you say to those sort of organisations?
So 2 questions in one there, Thomas, you have done. So the first one, I don't think I'm going to sit here and give advice to the NCA and HMRC, but what I would say is, there has been really great cross-organisational collaboration through the Economic Crime Plan led by the Home Office, and we've seen all those organisations you mentioned be at the front of that innovation, both in data sharing, data analytics, and working across to finance sector. So more of that, please, I would say. Yeah. I'd also implore them to keep sharing how they're building capability. I know there's some great initiatives HMRC mentioned around AI literacy for staff. Again, please do share that with your wider government and other colleagues, because all that kind of best practice is really welcomed. On people at maybe different scales in terms of their fraud journey, I'd say really think about what are you doing at the moment and how there can be both gains in terms of better recovery of your losses, but also efficiency and how your staff are responding to fraud already. So I think technology can help us by, taking a lot of manual steps out of the process. We talked about whether you're working in HR and pre-employment or in commercial finance. All of those areas lend themselves to be able to introduce data points and be able to look across vast amounts of data and give you an idea if there is some irregularity or some kind of issues that maybe then need to go to your fraud team. So I'd say everyone can be looking at that. Then secondly, in terms of how you respond, I think, again, technology can help you to be able to target those highest harm areas and make sure that your scarce resources, if you have smaller teams, can be pointed in the areas of most need. So I think overall there can be some initial outlay for data analytics or technology, but it can actually pay back in dividends, both in terms of your increased recovery, also the efficiency about how you're countering fraud.
Yeah, and I assume that where there are, perhaps groups or organisations doing similar counter fraud activity, sharing best practice and learning is going to be all the more valuable, because there's one thing at an HMRC level sort of counter fraud activity across the whole country. It's another thing, perhaps departmental challenges in relation to a particular type of fraud, both of which I think will have a slightly different approach.
Yeah, and I think, again, there are a lot of great free resources out there that can help. So obviously I'll mention the government counter fraud profession. There's some excellent frameworks, process guides that you can use to help you think about technology, both things like risk standards and prevention methodologies that we've covered. There's also really great resources on both the National Crime Agency and the National Cyber Security Centre. They all have both free training and resources that can help you think about better understand your threat insights and where to start. So I'd say there's some excellent resources out there.
Yeah, and I just for our international listeners, perhaps we could just reflect a little bit on, we've all accepted that fraud is an international business now in terms of where it's perpetrated. It doesn't care about the jurisdictions. Are there some good sources of knowledge and understanding in the international community?
Absolutely. And I was very fortunate when in the Cabinet Office to be part of the team working with the Five Eyes group. I'd really point to a couple of great websites, and apologies for any I've missed. One would be the GAO, so the National Audit Office equivalent in the US. They have an excellent site and some really great resources, particularly around different types of risk that are being reported in the US. And secondly would be the Commonwealth Fraud Prevention Centre, which is part of the Attorney General's Office in Australia. They have many toolkits and different frameworks and things, again, downloadable for free to help in every area and discipline of fraud.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a reflection of another podcast we should do, bring on some US or Australian colleagues.
Absolutely.
To compare and contrast the nuances of fraud in different jurisdictions. That sounds like a great idea. Right. Okay, let's go into the final session. So this is where we imagine it's 2030 and we kind of look at what we think the environment is and what the risks might be. So just over to you in terms of, any future predictions in terms of how fraud's going to develop and some thoughts.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we're going to keep seeing fraud go up because, as we said, our lives are digital now. So, I'm sure maybe even 20 years ago, we wouldn't be thinking that all our banking and all our kind of business interactions happen online. But unfortunately, it's quite easy for criminals to be able to target both mobile and other kind of portable devices. So I think we'll continue to see the proliferation of digital identity fraud and using increasingly AI to make their attempts better, to make images seem authentic. I think we're also going to continue to see a rise in things like romance fraud and investment fraud, again using deepfakes. I know increasingly we've been seeing the use of celebrities as well, which has led to the public, losing lots of money where they've appeared genuine. So unfortunately, I think we'll see the rise of AI to continue to help criminals. I also think technology such as smartwatches, virtual reality, will be kind of the future targets of criminals. Anywhere where we're kind of getting information or, providing personal information, I think will be a target for criminals.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, whereas, a fraudster today might follow up a number of avenues to defraud someone. And they might fail on, 10 sort of avenues, and they might move on to another avenue. With technology, it's just an ability to triage on a much greater scale, isn't it? So, a sophisticated criminal doesn't have to bother with all of that initial trying to spot the vulnerable person. There'll be technologies available that will be able to identify, potentially vulnerable people and also get that first indication that indeed they're willing to speak to you.
Yeah, I mean, we do see that victims becoming, victims over and over again. But I think you're right, the onset use of bots, which we're starting to see already, and quantum computing will again just magnify the kind of techniques that we're seeing already, just at a larger scale.
Yeah, I mean, quantum is a totally scary area, but
maybe a different podcast.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and as I say, there's loads of parallels here across different areas because all criminals, whatever nefarious activity they want to undertake, are simply trying to find vulnerabilities in whatever system, whatever person that they may be looking for. And unfortunately, technology, it just gives that great opportunity to search at scale for that. So yeah, in terms of how we tackle that with technology, I mean, it's a similar story. I guess it'd be interesting to get some of your reflections.
Yeah, I think what the key really is to detect as early as possible, because obviously it's expensive to take action once money has left or to re-protect your identity, etc. So we always want to try and upstream as much as possible, use data points, real-time information to verify and make sure that things are regular before we pay or provide credit, whatever we're doing, whatever line of business we're in. So I think that will continue. I think we talked earlier about, AI, thinking about how in any industry we can deploy AI to help to summarize information, make us more efficient in areas where we're more manual focused at the moment, will again free up time for that more task intensive work, such as evaluating risk and areas such as criminal prosecution that you mentioned, where a human element will always be needed. So I think that is how do we deploy technology to free us up to be able to focus on strategy and more analytical work.
Yes. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. I'm looking at our time here, and we've now hit a good amount of time. Is there anything else, more reflections you have before we wrap up?
I think probably reflection from me is I have worked in this area for quite a while. I have been genuinely very pleased, particularly over the past probably 4 or 5 years, to see the breaking down of silos and the coming together of people across industries. And I just, to anyone listening, I'd say let's keep that up. We can't tackle fraud and wider criminality on our own. We need to share intelligence. We need to be bold in how we kind of speak up and say when we have been victims of fraud, whether personally or as industry or organisations. So I think we need to continue that transparency, and then hopefully we will be able to turn the tide on the huge scale of fraud that we've been talking about today.
Brilliant. Well, Laura, thank you very much for coming to Bristol today to talk this through. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Joining the Dots with me, Thomas Drone. We hope you found today's conversation practical and insightful. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to uncover the stories of those on the front line of justice, harm reduction and global security. This is Thomas Drone, signing off. Thanks for listening.